On the evening of July 2nd, 1940, Vice Admiral James Somerville sat in the captain's quarters aboard the battlecruiser HMS Hood at Gibraltar and read a message from London that made his stomach turn. The signal from the Admiralty told him he was charged with one of the most disagreeable and difficult tasks that a British admiral had ever been faced with. It promised complete confidence. It demanded relentless execution. Somerville put the paper down and told his staff that this was the biggest political blunder of modern times and that they all felt thoroughly ashamed. The task was simple to describe and sickening to carry out. He was to sail his squadron across the western Mediterranean, confront the French fleet anchored at the naval base of Mers-el-Kebir on the coast of Algeria, and deliver an ultimatum. If the French refused every option on the table, Somerville was to open fire on the ships of Britain's oldest ally and destroy them. That was July 2nd, 1940. By July 4th, nearly 1,300 French sailors would be dead. Weybridge, Surrey, 1882. James found Somerville was born into a family that had salt water running through its veins. Through his grandmother, he was connected to the Hood dynasty, one of the most decorated naval families in British history. The same family whose name would be painted across the hull of the warship he would one day command. He entered the Royal Navy as a cadet in January of 1897, just 15 years old, joining the training ship HMS Britannia. Within a few years, he was serving as a midshipman aboard cruisers in the Channel Fleet and on the Pacific Station. By 1904, he was a full lieutenant. What set Somerville apart from other officers climbing the ranks was his obsession with a technology most senior admirals barely understood: wireless telegraphy. Radio. He joined the torpedo school HMS Vernon in 1907 to study it, and he never looked back. By the time the First World War broke out, Somerville was one of the Royal Navy's leading radio specialists, and it was this expertise that sent him to the Mediterranean, where he served as fleet wireless officer aboard battleships and cruisers supporting the disastrous Gallipoli campaign. The Dardanelles were a catastrophe for the Allies, but Somerville's personal performance was exceptional. He earned the Distinguished Service Order in 1916 and was promoted to commander before his 34th birthday. Between the wars, Somerville kept rising. Captain by 1921, Director of Signals at the Admiralty, Commodore of the Royal Navy Barracks at Portsmouth, Rear Admiral in 1933. He commanded destroyer flotillas in the Mediterranean during the Spanish Civil War, at one point leading an improvised international naval force that included a German pocket battleship and an Italian destroyer to prevent the bombardment of Palma, Majorca. By 1937, he was a Vice Admiral and Commander-in-Chief of the East Indies. His career was heading toward the very top of the Royal Navy. Then, his body betrayed him. In early 1939, doctors diagnosed Somerville with pulmonary tuberculosis. He was placed on the retired list. Just like that, a 42-year career appeared to be over. The Navy still honored him with a knighthood that June, which probably felt like a consolation prize. A distinguished old sailor put out to pasture while the world was catching fire. This decision seemed small at the time. It was not. Because 5 months later, Germany invaded Poland, and Britain needed every experienced officer it could find. Somerville was recalled to active duty. His tuberculosis either resolved or was reassessed, and instead of resting in the English countryside, he was thrown straight into the most urgent work the Navy had. First, he helped develop naval radar systems. Then, in May of 1940, he was pulled into the chaos surrounding Operation Dynamo, the evacuation of Dunkirk. Working under Admiral Bertram Ramsay, Somerville helped coordinate the desperate effort to pull the British Expeditionary Force off the beaches of northern France before the Wehrmacht could finish them off. He even visited the besieged garrison at Calais personally, meeting Brigadier Claude Nicholson to assess the situation on the ground before returning to England and making a radio broadcast about what he had witnessed. Dunkirk was a miracle of improvisation, but the broader situation was a disaster. The Allies were in a state of shock in the early summer of 1940. After the strange calm of the phony war, everything had come apart with terrifying speed. Denmark fell in a single day. Norway in 2 months. Then, in May, Hitler launched his blitzkrieg through the Low Countries and France. The Wehrmacht smashed through the Ardennes, outflanked the Maginot Line, and split the Allied armies in half. The British Expeditionary Force barely escaped across the Channel. France, which had been considered one of the great military powers on Earth, collapsed in just 6 weeks. By June 22, 1940, the French government, under Marshal Philippe Pétain, had signed an armistice with Nazi Germany. The Third Republic was dead. In its place stood the Vichy regime, a puppet state based in a spa town in central France. The war that Britain and France had been fighting together was suddenly Britain's war alone. Churchill stood in Parliament and declared that Britain would fight on the beaches, on the landing grounds, in the fields and in the streets. Britain would never surrender, and that was a rousing speech. But a speech does not sink a battleship. And that raised a question that kept Winston Churchill awake at night. What happens to the French Navy? France possessed the 4th largest fleet in the world. Modern battleships, fast cruisers, submarines, destroyers scattered across ports from Toulon to Dakar to Alexandria. The armistice terms under Article 8 allowed Germany to oversee French warships in their ports, supposedly for demobilization. The Germans promised they had no intention of using the French ships for their own purposes. Admiral François Darlan, the head of the French Navy, had personally promised Churchill that no French ship would ever fly a German or Italian flag. On June 24th, he had sent a telegram stating the ships would be destroyed before they were surrendered. He swore it. Churchill did not trust these promises, not because he doubted Darlan's sincerity in that moment, but because he knew that promises made under the pressure of an armistice could be broken the moment that pressure increased. He had watched Czechoslovakia hand over its entire arms industry to Hitler after Munich. He had watched country after country fold under German diplomatic and military pressure. And he knew that if Hitler added the French fleet to his own Kriegsmarine and Mussolini's Italian Navy, the Royal Navy would be outnumbered in every ocean that mattered. The math was brutal. The French fleet in German hands could tip the entire balance of the war. Britain might lose control of the Atlantic. The Mediterranean could become an Axis lake. The supply lines to the Middle East and India could be severed. An invasion of Britain itself would become far more plausible. Churchill decided that the risk was simply unacceptable. He could not allow it, not with Britain standing alone. In late June, the War Cabinet approved Operation Catapult. The plan was to simultaneously neutralize French warships at ports across the world. Ships in British harbours at Portsmouth and Plymouth would be boarded and impounded. Ships in Alexandria, Egypt, would be negotiated into disarmament by Admiral Andrew Cunningham. But the largest and most dangerous concentration of French naval power was anchored at Mers-el-Kebir, just northwest of Oran, on the Algerian coast. 4 capital ships sat there. The older battleships Bretagne and Provence moored stern first to the Long Harbour jetty, and the newer, faster battlecruisers, Dunkirk and Strasbourg, jewels of the French Navy, capable of challenging anything the Royal Navy could field. Add in a seaplane carrier, 6 large destroyers, and additional submarines and smaller warships nearby in Oran Harbour, and you had a fleet that could reshape the war if it fell into the wrong hands. Someone had to go deal with it. The job fell to Somerville. On June 28, 1940, the newly formed Force H came into existence at Gibraltar. Somerville hoisted his flag aboard HMS Hood, which was possibly the most famous warship in the world at that time. Joining Hood were the battleships Valiant and Resolution, the aircraft carrier Ark Royal, 2 light cruisers, and 11 destroyers. It was a formidable squadron, but its mission was not to fight Germans or Italians. It was to confront the French. Somerville was appalled. After conferring with Captain Cedric Holland, the former British naval attaché in Paris who spoke fluent French and had close personal friendships with senior French officers, Somerville sent a telegram to London expressing his strong opposition. Holland told him that using force would alienate every French person everywhere. Somerville agreed. He believed the operation would be a catastrophic political mistake that would turn a neutral France into an active enemy. London's reply was blunt. The firm intention of His Majesty's government was that if the French would not accept any alternative, their ships were to be destroyed. Under this cloud, Force H sailed from Gibraltar overnight on July 2nd. The warm Mediterranean night air carried the smell of engine oil and anxiety. Somerville hoped that his negotiator could talk the French into a peaceful solution. He had chosen Captain Holland specifically for the job, transferring him to the destroyer HMS Foxhound so he could approach the French harbour and deliver the British terms in person. The terms offered 4 options to Admiral Marcel Bruno Gensoul, the French commander at Mers-el-Kebir. First, bring your ships out and join the Royal Navy to continue fighting Germany. Second, sail with reduced crews to a British port, where the ships would be impounded and the crews sent home. Third, sail to a French port in the West Indies or to the United States, where the ships could be demilitarized and kept out of the war. Fourth, if none of these were acceptable, scuttle your ships where they sit. If all 4 options were refused, Force H would open fire. As the sun rose on July 3, 1940, the sea was calm and a warm haze hung over the Algerian coast. Force H arrived off Mers-el-Kebir, and the upper works of the French battleships were clearly visible over the harbour breakwater. At this point, things started going wrong almost immediately. Holland approached the harbour aboard HMS Foxhound early that morning, but the French refused him permission to enter. He transferred to the destroyer's motor launch and motored up to the anti-submarine boom guarding the harbour entrance. French sentries stopped him there. Holland was not even allowed inside the port. Instead, the initial negotiations had to be conducted right there at the boom, with Holland passing documents back and forth, not with Gensoul himself, but with the Admiral's aide-de-camp, Lieutenant Bernard Dufay, who shuttled between the launch and the flagship Dunkirk by lighter. Gensoul was furious from the start. He considered it a deliberate insult that the British had sent a captain to negotiate with a full admiral. Protocol demanded that Somerville himself should have come. The fact that Holland was a personal friend of many French naval officers, and that he spoke flawless French, and that he had specifically been chosen because of his deep connections to the French Navy, none of that mattered. The rank discrepancy poisoned the atmosphere before a single substantive word was exchanged. You'd think someone on the British side would have anticipated this problem. Nobody did. Hours dragged by in the July heat. Holland paced on the launch. Dufay went back and forth to the Dunkirk. Messages crawled between the harbour and Force H, which was steaming back and forth on the horizon, its guns visible to everyone in the port. Holland eventually managed to board Gensoul's flagship for a direct conversation late in the afternoon, but by then the damage was done. Gensoul had sent a message to the French Admiralty in Toulon, but he only reported 2 of the 4 British options. He told his superiors the choice was either to be interned by the British or to fight. He left out the option of sailing to the West Indies or America. He left out the option of scuttling in place. Whether this was deliberate distortion or a product of wounded pride, the result was the same. The French Admiralty saw only an outrageous ultimatum and responded by ordering reinforcements from Algiers and Toulon to steam toward Mers-el-Kebir at full speed, prepared for combat. The British intercepted these signals. Somerville now knew that French cruisers and additional warships were heading his way. Time was running out. Meanwhile, inside the harbour, the French fleet was preparing for action. Crews came to battle stations. Guns were trained. Steam was raised in the boilers. The French were getting ready to fight their way out if they had to, and the harbour they were stuck in was a trap. The ships were moored stern first to the jetty, facing inland. Their main guns pointed at the shore, not the sea. The only way out was a narrow channel protected by anti-submarine nets. The French ships were sitting targets, and everyone on both sides knew it. If you are finding this valuable so far, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. So, the negotiations had collapsed, but what Somerville did next made all of that look tame. At around 5:15 in the evening, Somerville signaled the Dunkirk directly. If his proposals were not accepted by 5:30, he would have to open fire. The French did not respond. Holland, who had been aboard the Dunkirk, trying desperately to reach some kind of agreement, was racing back to HMS Foxhound in a motor launch when the shooting started. He and his small crew were later picked up by a destroyer 15 miles offshore, drifting in their little boat under a white ensign. Before the guns fired, Swordfish torpedo bombers from Ark Royal had already dropped magnetic mines across the harbour exit to box the French ships in. French fighters had intercepted the strike aircraft and shot down one skua, killing both crewmen. These were the only British deaths in the entire action. At 5:54 in the evening, the 15-inch guns of Hood, Valiant and Resolution opened fire on the French fleet. The range was close. The French ships were pinned against the jetty, unable to maneuver, with their main batteries facing the wrong direction. The battleship Provence managed to fire back quickly, but Dunkirk and Strasbourg could not bring their forward-facing turrets to bear because of how they were moored. The third British salvo hit the Bretagne. What happened next was the kind of thing that stays with the men who witness it for the rest of their lives. The shells struck the old battleship's stern and penetrated into her ammunition magazines. The resulting explosion was enormous. A column of fire and black smoke erupted hundreds of feet into the air above the harbour. Within 8 minutes, the Bretagne had capsized and sunk. 977 of her crew died in the explosion, the fire, and the oil-covered water. Some were killed instantly by the blast. Others were trapped below decks as the ship rolled over. Others burned alive in fuel oil that had ignited on the surface of the harbour. For roughly 10 to 15 minutes, the guns of Force H rained shells down on the French ships in the harbour. The Dunkirk was hit multiple times and had to be beached on the western side of the harbour to prevent her from sinking. Around 200 of her crew were killed. The Provence was hit in the stern and also run aground. The destroyer Mogador had her entire stern section blown away. The seaplane carrier Commandant Test survived relatively unscathed through sheer luck. At 6:10, just 16 minutes after the first shots were fired, Gensol sent Somerville a signal. All of his ships were out of action. He requested a ceasefire. Somerville ordered the guns to stop. It appeared to be a grim, terrible success. But then a spotter aircraft sent an urgent signal. One French battleship had left the harbour and was heading east. The Strasbourg had pulled off something remarkable. Under the cover of the thick smoke pouring from the burning ships around her, Captain Louis Collinet had managed to get his battlecruiser moving. The ship threaded through the minefield, passed through the narrow channel, and broke out into open water with several destroyers following in her wake. Hood gave chase at 25 knots, and Ark Royal launched Swordfish torpedo bombers after the fleeing French ships, but the attacks failed to score any hits. As darkness fell, Somerville called off the pursuit. The Strasbourg reached Toulon the next day. Back at Mers-el-Kebir, the harbour looked like something out of a medieval painting of hell. Burning oil spread across the surface of the water in thick black sheets. Twisted metal jutted from half-sunken hulls. The Britannia's capsized bottom rose from the harbour like the back of a dead whale, oil still leaking from her wounds. Smaller boats moved through the carnage, their crews pulling survivors from the filthy water and recovering the bodies of those who had not survived. Some of the wounded had burns covering most of their bodies from the flaming fuel oil. Others had been pulled under by the suction of sinking ships. The next morning, as the sun rose over the devastated harbour, small tugs moved slowly through the wreckage. Sailors used grappling hooks and cargo nets to bring up the dead. What they found was often beyond identification. Fragments of men who had been whole human beings 12 hours earlier. Those who could be identified were laid out in improvised chapels. Those who could not were wrapped in sailcloth and driven to the cemetery above the harbour, where French soldiers hacked long trenches from the hard, dry North African ground. The wooden crosses above them bore a single word: Inconnu, unknown. 1,297 French sailors were dead. Over 350 more were wounded. The British had lost 2 airmen and 5 aircraft. Admiral Gensol stood over the graves and addressed his dead sailors. He told them they had promised to obey their superiors in whatever they might command for the honor of the flag and the greatness of the arms of France. The grief was real. The fury was real, and neither was confined to Mers-el-Kebir. The reaction from Vichy, France was explosive. Marshal Pétain condemned the attack as an act of aggression against a neutral former ally. On July 8th, France severed diplomatic relations with the United Kingdom. Vichy aircraft bombed Gibraltar in retaliation, though the raids caused little strategic damage. Admiral Darlan, the same man who had promised Churchill the fleet would never be surrendered, ordered French forces to attack British ships, though the order was rescinded the following day. Anti-British propaganda flooded France, portraying Churchill as a treacherous warmonger. The attack at Mers-el-Kebir had accomplished something that Hitler's propaganda machine had struggled to do. It turned many ordinary French citizens against Britain. And no, this was not the end of it. On July 8th, 5 days after the initial bombardment, the British attacked Mers-el-Kebir again. Swordfish torpedo bombers from Ark Royal returned to finish off the damaged Dunkirk. A torpedo struck the patrol boat Terre Neuve, which was moored alongside the battleship and loaded with depth charges. The patrol boat sank, and her depth charges detonated, ripping massive holes in the Dunkirk's hull. Another 154 French sailors died. Dunkirk was eventually towed to Toulon, but would never fight again. Back in London, Churchill addressed Parliament on July 4th with tears in his eyes. He called the attack on Mers-el-Kebir the most hateful decision, the most unnatural and painful in which he had ever been concerned. The House of Commons, which had been skeptical of Churchill's leadership, gave him a standing ovation. For many members, the attack proved that Britain was willing to do whatever it took to keep fighting, even if it meant killing the sailors of a nation that had been standing beside them just weeks earlier. The international reaction was mixed but leaned in Churchill's favor where it mattered most. President Franklin Roosevelt privately told associates he would have done the same thing. Secretary of State Cordell Hull had already warned the French ambassador that the French fleet in German hands would be comparable to a cannon pointed at the United States. The attack at Mers-el-Kebir, whatever else it was, sent a clear signal to Washington that Britain was not going to negotiate or surrender. Britain was going to fight. And that message would prove critical in securing American support in the months ahead. For Somerville personally, the aftermath was complicated. He had carried out his orders, but he had done so under protest, and he would carry the weight of Mers-el-Kebir for the rest of his life. He was not finished with controversy either. In November 1940, after the Battle of Cape Spartivento, Churchill was furious that Somerville had not pursued the retreating Italian navy more aggressively. An official inquiry was launched, but the investigation found that Somerville had acted entirely appropriately. Churchill backed down, but the tension between the Prime Minister and the Admiral never fully disappeared. What did not go away was Somerville's skill as a fighting sailor. In February 1941, Force H bombarded the Italian port of Genoa, along with strikes on Leghorn and Spezia, using the battlecruiser Renown, the battleship Malaya, the carrier Ark Royal, and the cruiser Sheffield. They returned to Gibraltar without a single casualty. Throughout 1940 and 41, Force H ran convoys to the besieged island of Malta, beating off attacks by Italian warships and aircraft in some of the most dangerous waters in the Mediterranean. Then came the pursuit that cemented his reputation forever. In May 1941, the German battleship Bismarck, the pride of the Kriegsmarine, broke out into the North Atlantic. She was hunting British merchant convoys, and in the Denmark Strait on May 24th, she sank HMS Hood with a single devastating hit to the battle cruiser's magazine. Hood, the same ship that had been Somerville's flagship at Mers-el-Kebir, went down in minutes. Over 1,400 men died. Only 3 survived. The Royal Navy was shaken to its core. Force H was operating in the Atlantic at the time, and Somerville positioned his ships to block the Bismarck's escape route toward the French port of Brest. On the evening of May 26th, Swordfish torpedo bombers launched from Ark Royal attacked the Bismarck at wave-top height, loosing their torpedoes into a rough sea. One of them struck the German battleship's stern and jammed her rudders. The Bismarck could no longer steer. She was trapped. The next morning, the home fleet closed in and sank her. Without Somerville's Ark Royal and Force H, the Bismarck might well have escaped. By March of 1942, Somerville was given command of the Eastern Fleet in the Indian Ocean, operating from Ceylon and later from Kenya after the Japanese advance forced him to relocate. He faced Admiral Nagumo's carrier strike force during the devastating Indian Ocean raid of April 1942, losing a light carrier, 2 heavy cruisers, and several other ships. But forewarned by intelligence, Somerville managed to keep his main battle fleet out of the Japanese trap, preserving British naval power in the region through careful, pragmatic decision-making rather than reckless aggression. He was relieved of the Eastern Fleet Command in August 1944 and spent the final year of the war as head of the British naval delegation in Washington, where he built strong working relationships with American naval commanders. He was promoted to Admiral of the Fleet in May 1945, the highest rank in the Royal Navy, a title held by only a handful of men in the service's history. After the war, he retired to the quiet village of Dinda in Somerset, where he served as Lord Lieutenant of the county. He died on March 19, 1949, at his home, Dinda House. He was 66 years old. But here is the detail that puts the entire story of Mers-el-Kebir in a different light. In November of 1942, more than 2 years after Somerville's guns had torn through the French fleet, the Allies invaded North Africa in Operation Torch. In response, Hitler launched Operation Anton, sending German forces to occupy the previously unoccupied zone of southern France. Panzer divisions rolled south toward the Mediterranean coast. German troops moved to seize the French fleet at Toulon, exactly the scenario that Churchill had warned about and feared back in the summer of 1940. And when the German soldiers reached the gates of the naval base on November 27th, the French sailors did exactly what Admiral Darlan had always promised they would do. They scuttled their own ships. Over 70 warships were sunk by their own crews, including battleships, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines. Among them was the Strasbourg, the very battlecruiser that had escaped Somerville's guns at Mers-el-Kebir and raced through the smoke to Toulon 2 years earlier. She went to the bottom of the same harbor she had fled to for safety. The French fleet sank itself rather than serve Nazi Germany. Darlan's promise had been genuine all along, which means the 1,300 men at Mers-el-Kebir may well have died for nothing. Or maybe Churchill was right that the promise could not be trusted until it was tested by events. Maybe the willingness of the French to scuttle at Toulon in 1942 was partly shaped by the knowledge of what the British had done at Mers-el-Kebir in 1940. Nobody can know for certain. What we do know is that in 1990, 50 years after the attack, the Royal Navy's own official magazine described the bombardment of Mers-el-Kebir as one of the most distasteful acts the Royal Navy has ever had to perform. Somerville knew that on the night he received his orders. He said so. He protested. He tried to stop it. And when he could not, he carried it out anyway, because that is what duty demanded. The same admiral who wept over French graves went on to help sink the Bismarck, defend the Indian Ocean, and rise to the very pinnacle of the Royal Navy. He was, by every measure, a great sailor and a great leader. Those are the words Admiral Cunningham used to describe him. But greatness in war does not come without scars. And the harbor at Mers-el-Kebir, with its oil-stained water and unmarked graves, was the scar that James Somerville carried to his own. If this story stayed with you, hit the subscribe button and leave a comment telling us what you think Churchill should have done. Should he have trusted the French to keep their word, or was the risk too great? We will see you in the next one.